I will start by creating sample table. So I will create a table with 5 columns. Columns are continent, subcontinent, country, state, and sales. Then I will insert data inside of this table. So I will insert these 5 rows, and then we can read from our table just to see how it looks like. This is our table. I will now jump to Excel. So above this virtual machine, I will open Excel, and here we can see the same table. And from this table, I will create a pivot table. And inside of this pivot table, I can see all of these detailed numbers. So I can see 1, 2, 4, 8, and 60. But here we can also see subtotals, and we can see a grand total. And the question is how to create a query in Monet that will give us all of the numbers that are needed for one pivot. Well, we can use a query like this one here. So we can first create one query that will return these rows with detailed numbers. Then we will create one query that will group values by country. So we will get subtotals. And we can have one query that will return the grand total, and we can use it to get this value here, that's this row here, and then we can union all of these rows. I will now go back to virtual machine, and I will jump to this web page. Here we can see such a query, and when we execute it and when we order our rows, we can get something like this. This is similar to pivot table in Excel. But here we can see several problems with this query. First, we have to execute 3 queries, and then we have to combine the result of these 3 queries. Second, it is really hard to read and to maintain such long query. And third, because we are using union all, we always have to match columns. And to solve this problem, we can use grouping sets. So instead of running a query like this one, I will now jump here to Monet, and I will run this query that has 3 subqueries. To get this, we will use grouping sets. I will now clean my screen. I will now paste here one statement, and this statement will show us syntax for grouping sets. So we will use grouping sets to define how this query will be grouped, and we will group this query by country, then by state, and then we will calculate grand total. Empty parentheses are for the grand total. So I will run this, and we will got exactly that. We will got rows that are aggregated per country. Then we will have rows that are aggregated per state, and at the end we will have grand total. We can understand this better if we jump here to this web page, and here we can see the same data set, just the rows are sorted. So we can see that our data set is just like a pivot table. We have a grand total, we have subtotals, and we have detailed rows. And this is the same result as the one that we got when we used that union all query. Just this time we have these nulls. But we will see later how we can deal with nulls inside of grouping sets query. I will now go back to terminal, and I will show you how we can create more complex groups. For that, we will use parentheses. This is another statement, and here again we have a country, state, and grand total, but this time country and state are combined inside of one group. So this is just one group, and this is another group. So now we have only 2 groups. So if I run this, at the end we will have a grand total, but beside that we will have the result for only one group, and this is the group country state. So we have 5 rows for this first group and grand total for empty parentheses. Again, I will jump to this web page. We can see the same result here. So we have with green color group that is defined by country and state, and with red color we have a grand total. You can better understand how parentheses are used to define groups if we take a look at this query. This time we are using continent and subcontinent to define the group, but then again we are using continent to define another group. So we can use the same column several times, but in different groups. So I will run this, And here we can see two rows with continent and subcontinent, and one row that is calculated just for the continent. And now we can understand that groups can be defined just by one column or by combining several columns inside of parentheses. I will now jump again to this web page. I will go down here, and here we can see two queries that would return similar result. On the left side we have a grouping sets query, and on the right side we have a query that is using union all. Inside of it we have two select queries. We have select query that is using column 1 and column 2 to define its grouping, and we have this another select query that is using just column 1 to define its grouping logic. But instead of using two select queries, we can just use definition of their logic. So we can use column 1 and column 2 to define one group inside of our grouping sets, and we can use column 1 to define another group inside of our grouping sets. So each group will replace the whole select query, and this is why grouping sets queries are much shorter, and they will also be executed much faster, so they are much better. I will now go back to terminal. I will clear my screen. We will now talk about rollup. Rollup is a way to define grouping sets that are based on hierarchy between columns. I will paste here one statement, and here we have rollup of 3 columns. But these 3 columns are connected in hierarchy because we have several countries in one subcontinent and several subcontinents in one continent. To better understand this hierarchy, I will jump again to this Excel file, and here we can see a pivot table. Inside the pivot table we have a hierarchy. So we have detail rows at the bottom, then we have subtotals as a middle level, and then we have grand total. So our hierarchy is country state, then just country, and then grand total. And we have the similar thing inside of the rollup. So if I run this, we will notice that we got grand total, then we have subtotal that is based on the continent, then subtotal that is based on the continent and subcontinent, and then we have detail rows. We can better understand this if we jump to this web page, and here we can see the same table. But let's label this first column as A, second as B, and third as C. So these first rows are defined with group ABC. Then we have group AB, and then group A, and then grand total. So rollup from columns ABC is the same as grouping sets with 4 groups. So groups are ABC, AB, A, and grand total. One thing that is important for rollup is the order of columns, because rollup of ABC is not the same as rollup of CBA. Here we have group AB, and here we have group CB, and here we have group A, and here we have group C. So order is important because hierarchy is defined by that order. I will now go back to terminal, and I will show you how we can use parentheses inside of rollup statement. I will show you another statement, and here we have one complex group. So this group is made of 2 columns, and this would be that element A, so state will be element B. So we have A and B, so our groups will be A, B, just A, and then grand total. So if I run this, we have grand total, then we have group A, because group A is defined by subcontinent and country, and then we have A and B. I will now clear my screen. Next we will talk about cube. Cube is similar to rollup. Cube and rollup have similar syntax, but the logic is different. Cube will accept some columns, and then it will return all the possible groups that are made by combining those columns. So if I run this, we will get 4 groups. We will first have grand total, then we have group with subcontinent, then we have group with only country, and then we have a group with subcontinent and country. A number of these groups is calculated as 2 on number of columns. So we have 2 columns, 2 on 2 is 4, so we have 4 groups. We can also use parentheses with cube, so I will run this other statement. This time we only have one element. This is a complex element that is made of subcontinent and country. So if we have one element, the number combination will be 2 on 1, that is equal to 2. So if I run this, we will have just grand total, and we will have a group with subcontinent and country. I will now jump to this web page, and here we can see that if we had 3 columns, A, B, and C, then we will have 2 on 3 groups. So we would have group ABC, AB, AB, AC, BC, ABC, and grand total. So we would have 8 groups. I will now go back and I will clean my screen. When we are using grouping sets, we can use addition and multiplication. If we use addition, then this is our syntax. In this case, we have one grouping sets expression, and inside of it we can have a continent, we can have a rollup, we can have a cube, grand total, and so on. I will now show you one example for addition. So I will paste here this statement in which I'm using grouping sets, and inside of grouping sets I have subcontinent and I have rollup of country. Now rollup of country will return country, and it will also return grand total. So we will have subcontinent, we will have country, and we will have grand total. So if I run this, we will have addition. So here we can see grand total, here we can see country, and here we can see subcontinent. If we are using addition, we can easily create duplicates, and for that I will show you this other statement. Here we are using grouping sets, and inside of it we have cube of the continent. Now cube of the continent will return continent, but it will also return grand total, and here we have grand total as a standalone element. So if I run this, we will have these 2 rows that are created because of cube, and here is the row that is created because of this standalone element, but now we have 2 grand totals. Next, we will see a syntax for multiplication. If we are using multiplication, then syntax is like this. Now everything is divided by commas. So we have grouping sets separately, then we have comma, then we have some rollup, then comma, then cube, comma, grand total, comma, then some other column, and so on. I will now give you an example for multiplication. So I will paste this statement here, and now we have first rollup of the continent. Now in our case, rollup of the continent will return America and grand total. And grouping sets of the subcontinent will return values north and central. And then we will create cross join between these values. So here we have 2 values, here we have 2 values, 2 times 2 is equal to 4. So we will get 4 rows. So we have America combined with north and central, and then we have grand total combined with north and central. When we are using multiplication, it is also easy to create duplicates. So I will paste this other statement, and here we have grouping sets that are made of the continent and grand total, and then we have the same grouping sets repeated. So this first grouping set will return American grand total, and this other will return American grand total. So we will have America times America, then America times grand total, then we will have grand total times America, and then at the end grand total times grand total. So if I run this, we will have those 4 rows. I will now jump to this web page, and here we can see better what is addition and what is multiplication. So addition means that we have 2 groups, and then we will just create a set of those 2 groups. But multiplication means that from each group we will take its values, and then for those values we will create a cross join. So each value from this first element will be combined with each value from this other element to get this list here. So it is like a cross join. I will now go back and I will clean my screen. In data set that was created by using grouping sets, we have different rows. We have detail rows, we have subtotals, we have grand total. And we will now see how to use grouping function to inform us what rows are subtotals or grand total. In such rows, some columns are consolidated. So instead of several rows, they now only have 1 row. So instead of several values, they now only have a null. And this function will accept just 1 argument. That argument is the name of a column. And only for that column, this function will inform us whether some row has that column consolidated or not. I will now show you one statement, and here we can see how we are using grouping function. So we have continent column, but we also have grouping of the continent, and besides subcontinent we have grouping of the subcontinent. So in these two columns we will get information of whether these two columns are consolidated in some row. I will now run this, and we can see that these first two rows are detail rows. So there is no consolidation because we can see zeros inside of these two new columns. But here we can see a 1. For subcontinent column, we can see 1. That means that that column was consolidated inside of this row. And in grand total, we will see 1 for a continent and 1 for subcontinent, because all of the columns are consolidated inside of the grand total. We can jump now to this web page where we can see that better. So we have zeros in first two rows, then we have 1 in the third row, and in the fourth row we will have 1s for all of the columns. And this grouping function is important because it will help us to distinguish rows where we have nulls because those rows are subtotals or grand total, compared to rows where we have nulls because we have missing values. I will now clear my screen. If we use grouping sets inside of some query, then our result will not be great looking. I will now run this statement here, and this is what I will got. So inside of this result I have some nulls, and also the sort order of rows is not perfect. It is not the same as in the pivot table. So I want to solve these two problems. First, I will use coalesce function to solve the problem of the nulls. And for that, I will say that I have nulls in these two columns, and I will change those nulls to something else. For that, I will use coalesce function, and I will change nulls to words grand or total. So if I run this, now we can easily see that this row here is for the grand total and that these two rows are for subtotals. Then we will use grouping function to solve the problem of the sort order. So I will use this statement here, and here I have created two auxiliary columns with grouping function, and I will use these two auxiliary columns inside of my order by clause. So they will help me to create a proper sort order. So if I run this, now we can notice that I have used this column here to place grand total at the bottom of a table, and I have used this column here to place subtotals beneath each subcontinent. At the end, I want to get rid of these two auxiliary columns, and for that I will just wrap my statement inside of another select statement that will select only 3 columns that we need. So if I run this, we will get something that is the most looking like a pivot table. I will now clear my screen. I will now start talking about comments on database objects. But before that, I will create some sample tables. So I will create table with the name tab comment. I will also create one temporary table. And inside of these two tables, I will not place any data, so they will be empty. I will also create one function. And now I can tell you that we can create comments on most of the database objects, and comments are a way to convey some information about those objects. For example, we can create a comment on a table, and for that we would use syntax like this one. So we have a comment on table, then the name of a table, and then at the end we will provide our comment. So I will run this. We can also create a comment on a column, and we will use similar syntax. And then again we can create a comment on a function. And we can also create comment on a schema. After this, I will try to find IDs of these 4 objects. So first I will look for ID of my table. And inside of this system table we can find that ID, and that ID is 50,960. I will use that number to search for ID of my column. So this is ID of my column. Then I will search for ID of my function. And I will also search for ID of my schema. So why am I looking for these IDs? Well, I'm looking for them because I will now read from the system table sys.comments, and I will read only rows that have these IDs. So I will run this, and here we can find our comments. So all of them are inside of this system table, and beside ID of a database object, we can find a comment about that object. I will now clean my screen. We will now see how we can delete comments. If we delete a database object, then the comment for that object will be deleted. If I now read from system table sys.comments, and if I search for a comment for this table, I will not find it anymore. We can also explicitly delete comment, and for that we just have to say that comment is null. So comment on schema sys is null. So if we now try to read that comment, we will not find it because it is deleted. It is also possible to delete a comment by using empty string. So if we say that comment on this function is empty string, then that comment will be deleted. And if we search for that comment inside of the system table, we will not find it. Now notice here that if function is overloaded, in that case we have to provide a full signature of a function. Now comments can be created on almost all of the persistent database objects. For example, I will first jump to this web page. We can create comment on a view, on an index, sequence, procedure, aggregate, or load. But we cannot create comments on temporary objects. For example, we have that temporary table, and I will try to create a comment on a temporary table, and I will fail. So we cannot create comment on object that is temporary.